Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Context Ops, right? Today I have with me Jessica. Hi Jessica, good morning.
Thank you for having me.
Really excited about this specific episode because and I think Jessica is one of the most passionate advocates of knowledge management, knowledge architecture out there today. She's one of one of the few people, right, who have actually been doing this way before it was cool for the longest time ever, right? Jessica, so I know you do, you currently have your consulting practice and you spent of, you obviously have an amazing Substack and your book is coming up and maybe you should talk about that as well at some point. But
Yes.
would love to hear, right, how did you end up doing what you're doing today?
This part of my career started in 1997. I was
Hmm.
hired by Steven Spielberg I worked as a visual history cataloger for,
Hmm.
off of his movie Schindler's List. He started a nonprofit to capture everyone's narrative and stories regarding, about the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors. So that's really where it started. And we built, one of the largest visual history catalogs of its time, which made 2 to 6 minute segments of any video recording clip. So it was sort of the beginning of clips. We were still working with VHS tapes, but using machine systems. So I participated. I was an employee in that project, and that's sort of how my entire career kicked off. And I worked in the GLAM space, so galleries, libraries, arts, and museums, and really stayed in the cultural heritage space, which is, that project was considered part of, and worked a little bit here and there for businesses, enterprises. And so I sort of flip-flopped between enterprise work and cultural heritage work. And then come 2018, I fully migrated over into the enterprise space. But along the way, I did get a master's in information and library science with a specific focus or specialization in informatics, which was well before the current ontology knowledge graph craze. Informatics in the library science space were things like the semantic web and ontologies and taxonomies. So that's really what I studied during my master's. And so that's how I ended up where I am today.
A lot of conversation today in the mainstream media is about how things are changing so fast, how everything is changing, and you know, people will be out of their jobs, and software will be completely automated, and so on and so forth, right? But then there is a world of people, or there's an alternative school of thought by folks in the knowledge management space, folks who have spent some time in symbolic systems, export systems, and so on. Or they have a very contrarian answer to that question, which is what has changed, right? So back to you. What according to you has really changed, and what has?
What has changed? Interest, and that when you say ontology, people don't look at you like you're crazy. So that's a good thing.
Yeah,
Requirements of AI, the cost of tokens usually is a bigger, as soon as money comes into the picture, it becomes a big motivator and attention getter
yeah.
or attention mechanism. And so those two things for sure. Um, and then, of course, people not being able to find things within systems, which actually existed before, when I was hired before the current AI craze. It was usually because systems were a mess and they were having just difficulty with information retrieval, just simple information retrieval. But people are realizing, maybe more slowly than I think I personally would like. There's more learning to do in this space in terms of ontologies and knowledge graphs and symbolic AI. Because most people think that the current, AI as we know it now, that's AI. There's no other form of AI, which obviously is not true. There's a long history to artificial intelligence. It was a word that was created coming out of the Dartmouth summer of 1956 and part of automation and replacement theory. And so there's actually a couple of main tracks or schools or philosophies related to artificial intelligence as we know it. One's augmentation and one's automation. And so we have just there's a lot of education that's necessary. But the fact that people are now realizing that, that there's a better way to describe and to make sense of information in order to leverage that for, to optimize LLM type implementations is fantastic. It's just, I feel like we're just getting started. And so it's like the tip of the iceberg. As you know, my friend Tony Seal says, it's like that boulder's at the top of the hill. And it's like, are you going to let it roll and go and cut it loose? The one of the problems is that now that the word ontology, for example, is in play, is it gives opportunity for marketing folks to take a hold of it and decide to define it their own terms in their own ways.
Yeah,
And that's just like, we're all, in the semantic web community, the symbolic AI community, we're all just sitting there with bated breath to see like what direction does this turn.
I know. Yeah. No, we also had Tony on the podcast a few weeks back, and then and this came out, which is everybody has a very convenient interpretation of the word ontology, of the word context. And I think Tony's take was the marketing of a specific word
Mhm.
has an inverse ratio towards actual relevance in the practical enterprise AI world. So yeah,
Well, and
something
it
of
does,
that sort.
it's a disservice.
Yeah,
That's the sad thing, is it's a disservice. We saw context graphs and what happened with that and how many
yeah,
people, it's just like we grab onto whatever. There's a certain desperation in the industry right now, and it's a human reaction, I guess, but it's also at the same time, it's misleading because it is a
this,
discipline, and the
yes,
discipline around building symbolic systems. It's not like this came out of nowhere. I actually was just talking to a pretty big leader in the space, and he asked me, he said, well, where did this come from? Are there only like, there must be only a handful of ontologists in the world. It's like we're taking this old concept and we're just dusting it off. And he said, I imagine there's only what, 10, 12 ontologists in the world. I mean, that was truly the perspective. And this is a big leader in technology in the industry. And I mean, there's thousands of us. We've had conferences ongoing for 50 plus
for the
years.
longest time. Yes,
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, we have our own journals, we have our own research,
yeah,
cycles, we have our own, there's entire academic programs built around this worldwide, and so it's like, no, it's just it's a new domain is coming into play, but it doesn't mean it's a new domain.
yeah.
There's science, there's research, there's expertise. It's not something that all of a sudden you can grab a hold of and redefine and override.
Yeah, yeah. No, very true, very true. Now, because you brought that out, right? Let's do a bunch of myth busting along the way over the next few minutes at least, right? So one reason, in fact, why we chose to name the show Context Ops, because our thesis has been that it's not a once and done thing. It's a discipline that'll have which will emerge, which one people will understand eventually as they try to operationalize, or bring in symbolic angles to their AI implementations and so on. But I guess one very poorly understood or poorly used word, and hence it impacts actual implementations, is this whole thing around context engineering, right? And I think you also wrote about this in your Substack as well, which is a lot of people think about context engineering as, or it is the first version, but how much can we stuff in?
Yeah, yeah.
We have a 1 million context window. Let's stuff in whatever we can. Right. Like that was the first interpretation of it, which is really just like a very simple marketing spin on prompt engineering, which now feels like eons ago.
We forget when how excited everyone got when the context window got bigger. Like
Bigger.
those sorts of things, like people celebrating, oh,
Yeah.
I get to stuff more in. Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think it'll work better now. But like unfortunately, we sort of, finally there is acknowledgement that it actually does not. But I do want to go back to what you also mentioned some time back, which is you refer to context as a property
Mm.
and not as an object, right? Could you elaborate that a bit more?
Yeah. We think of context as like a paragraph or a sentence, It's like if I give it a document, that's context. If I give it a paragraph or a sentence or a list of words, that's context. But in fact, it's the way, how do we describe that document? What does that document or that paragraph have to do with other documents or paragraphs within a space if we're talking about content, for example? And so the idea of it being a property is like we have to describe these things. In ontology world, the classes are more or less immutable and defined things within our space. And within ontologies, we model property relations and properties to help to apply descriptors to these things, to help to define the relationships between things. And the truth is, and you can look back through the literature and research from the beginning of time, is that context exists in the relationship between things, right? Context can vary widely when you change the relationship and the type of relationship between things. And so that to me is where a lot, because context is such an ambiguous, nebulous word. It could mean anything. It's just worked its way into our vernacular and vocabularies where it's just like I almost catch myself and try not to use the word context anymore because it becomes this really, really, my business, by the way, I know that you guys are context ops, but my business, well before any of this, is called contextually. So I'm just kind of like cringe every time I have to write that
Yeah.
because it's the meaning of when we overuse a term where it can really mean anything. That definition is wide open.
Yeah.
When we talk about context as a property, it's really like, okay, great, you have documents. Sure, that's context. But really, where does context live? It's the relationships between these things, which then would make it a property.
Yeah. And the unfortunate extension or extrapolation of that has been, oh no, it's now MD files. It's now one more, let's just sort of store everything into an MD file. And maybe that's the cure of, or that's not, maybe that qualifies as context, unfortunately.
Yeah. And well, the thing is that with MD files, it's been proven like there's a lot of research going on right now. Is HTML better than Markdown? Like really no one knows per se. And there's a lot of research pointing to the fact that it becomes very noisy at scale for LLMs.
Yeah.
MD files. So it really depends on, the word depends is also very common with an AI because it's not really been exacted into a science yet. So, I don't know if many of the listeners or you guys remember when for SEO plays, Geo or AEO, there was the idea of LLM text.
Yes.
And
And
so
let the
yes, yes. And so there have been so many attempts, and none of this has ever been codified into science. If anything, the challenge is to prove or disprove these rumors. And I think that it speaks to the desperation in the marketplace because the truth is, if you're going to define things ontologically, it's hard. It's not easy. It's a process. It's not fast. It's not immediate. So the
Mm,
build fast break things with an ontology is doesn't really vibe. It doesn't really work.
yeah.
So watch in organizations that there's sort of false attempts and then this, you know, that's when we end up with these sort of derivative plans or architectures that are kind of ontology-ish, but not quite
Quit there.
all the way in terms of that descriptive context. And so I think we're all sitting in this kind of uncomfortable transition right now. And of course, then
Yeah.
there's the marketing machine. So yeah.
Help me understand this. When you walk into some of these, yeah, please, Josh. Yeah.
So Jessica, I was just thinking about what you said, right? Relationships are everything. Um, like for the viewers, right? They might not come from ontological background. So how does that look? I'm just trying to grapple with loading something into context windows versus structured, descriptions of meaning.
Yes.
So how would you what's the boundary there? Uh, how do we distinguish between the two, like the relationship, a well-defined relationship versus something, some people might say like, hey, I put this text in. I defined it. I mean, I did it. I put text in, right? And I think I've read. You have mentioned something like that. People talk about this, like text, but that's not it. So for the viewers, like, how do you distinguish between that?
Well, there's different types of just supplying text to, within a context window. Do the world and of AI is changing, that landscape is changing so quickly. So if you use Claude, now you can build skills to help to guide some accuracy, hopefully, around the text that you're supplying in the context window. But then there's the question of, are you building, are you giving text to an LLM in the context window in an ephemeral way, meaning that you just copy paste and then that's a one shot, and you're in an organization where, I don't know, 300 people are doing the exact same thing, so everyone's paragraphs or documents can vastly vary, therefore the results are very non-scientific because
Yeah.
everyone's working within their own context. So it gets kind of wildly unruly. And then you have things like RAG implementations. You can leverage project folders. So your context window, if you're working with prompts, you can have more stable versions of context that to have that persistence over time. So now we have all these nuanced architectures, but when we talk about relationships, it's like, we know that RAG exists. Relationships may be as simple as a thesaurus or a taxonomy that's encoded with resource descriptive framework, or as triples or RDF, which is the same serialization format that makes ontologies ontologies. It's RDF. So those are W3C specifications. It's all within the same family of standards and documentation, W3C documentation. So that's the World Wide Web Consortium. These are all open. It's all part of the same discipline that are knowledge graphs, ontologies, taxonomies. Those types of implementations give way to things like memory, like persistence over time, stability, in everyone referring to the same context, where you have structured things. I mean, you could even have documents structured within a graph database, and have graph embeddings, for example, that tell us that this document A has this type of relationship to document B. And you can create this really elegant knowledge infrastructure that says persistent memory and reference for an LLM. And that can permeate and exist so that everyone's using that same source of truth or context in an organization, versus the cowboy deployment methodology, which is everyone just throwing things into the window. Some people using skills, some people not, those sorts of things.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is spend more time associating meaning, right?
Yeah.
And that would naturally, follow, like you would be on the same page with at least your team, possibly other teams in the same organization.
Yeah. So the context, many people think, okay, we need just one definition, one canonical definition, and one canonical word. Well, for example, the SCOS data model, the RDF SCOS data model, is built to handle a preferred term and as many alternate labels as you want, all rolled up to the same identifier. So where you think there may not be a solution, you would be surprised there are solutions. There are really elegant solutions to handle almost every nuanced problem that an organization faces. I think the bigger problem is that we spend too much time trying to figure out how can we cram this back into our Postgres and relational databases. There's still this underlying artifact and a mental model that everything needs to be oriented and pushed back into these databases. And the truth is that it's really hard, like to maintain the structure of an ontology and the depth of the relationships, because ontologies don't roll up to primary keys and foreign keys. They don't have the same requirements. It's a different type of model. It's a different type of architecture. It's a different thing entirely. I'll give you an example. I'm working right now on a project with an organization, and it was refreshing to hear them say, yeah, mostly what's in our data bricks is finance and accounting. Like, we care about money, right? In our database, we care about money. So where does the other context live? Is marketing and branding in the database? Nope. Is all those different influences in the system? Is the SharePoint in all of the documents? Is the Confluence in the database? Nope. And so if you operate from that data only perspective as well, you are missing context. Most people are still, their operating model is still around, okay, let's like lift and shift what's in the database and those schemas and everything else and reflect that. Well, guess what? You're going to be missing probably 3/4 of your organization's context.
Yeah, that's a really refreshing take on that. Like a lot of us, would think when you're building a system, a software system, you think of some kind of a database that you're gonna be modeling things in that entity and relationship, but you're not gonna think about like the rest of the world and maybe, the larger context. I mean, we're using the word context a lot right now. So in the last few sentences, yeah. But yeah, that's really interesting. I think we had on a few other. I think somebody else was talking about something similar where they had to manage accounting, and it sounded a lot like this, right? The inverse of what you're saying. Initially, it would have been like an RDBMS, but then they said, "Hey, let's just get all the context," and that was refreshing because then they were completely opened up and they could really think about first principles there. So
Yes.
thanks for that. Yeah. I had one question. So you mentioned something interesting. So you said spend time on you know doing the hard work of defining things in an ontology. Um, we've seen a lot of people struggle with that, right? They wonder if that time is worth spending, even if everybody says
Yeah.
that it is. But one interesting thing that I heard you say was like the SKOS, right? So, um, what if you would spend time on like a vocabulary, using a vocabulary or a taxonomy? Would that be a good first
Yeah.
step?
Oh my gosh, that's my ontology pipeline is all about that. And I get a lot of pushback from like purist ontologists as well on that. And there's a reason. And it is more of a library science approach, an information science approach, because a lot of ontologists or ontology engineers are coming from spaces where they don't have that same discipline of organizing that comes with library and information science. So it's really, really important. How can you model what you have not defined? So the act of organizing your vocabularies, which is why the semantic layer is so popular right now, is because you have to have, remember, we're working with language models. So the biggest problem in organizations right now are labels and definitions, meaning. That is the first step. If you define your vocabularies and you structure it with SCOS, for example, which is a data model in RDF, it's your first step into the land of RDF. You first have to understand and learn how to write RDF, what it looks like, what is valid, what is not valid. You also, from that's the technical component. And then the organizational component is definitions, breaking down silos, labels, like that very basic thing, the same thing that the semantic layer is looking to address. The reason ontologies are hard is if you try to model ontologies on your existing data and your existing taxonomies, vocabularies, labels, semantic labels, whatever, you're going to harden and you're going to just basically project those silos and that confusion up into your ontologies. And it's going to be reflected. you're going to end up with duplicates. The ambiguity is going to persist because you haven't defined it. You risk representing relationships incorrectly for lack of definitions. I'm working on another job right now where we were reviewing with subject matter experts the specific taxonomy that we were building, SCOS model for them. And one of their top level categories was called other. And I said, we're not going to have other in the taxonomy. And they said, no, but we can define it. And it's like, it's still not okay because imagine if every team has other and there are things organized and categorized under other. If you
Was
can
there a different definition of other? I'm sorry, I just had to know.
everyone, it's like freestyle. Anyone can define it, right? I've been in organizations where there's other, miscellaneous, others, like 4 or 5 different labels. So does that give you
It's the same
context
thing.
and meaning?
It's what we thought other was, right? There's nothing different about us.
It's your junk drawer. It's like if you can categorize things under it, then you can name it. And it's, the question is, I'm not going to say it's lazy, but from a building, like if you're really serious about context, you need to take the time to define things. And I think that it's very hard for people because it's not fun work. For some, I find it fun. I like it, but the social, it helps to inform. It's necessary discovery for building ontologies. I can't model an ontology unless I understand the meaning of things.
What I'm
que-
hearing you say is your investment in that, and maybe we can probably run a background, definitions of what an ontology and vocabulary, etc. is. But what I'm sensing is if you force that, if you invest in the vocabulary, which is at least a starting point, you almost naturally progress because that's what I heard you say. You progress to even defining the relationship
Yes.
where you would eventually anyway come up with some kind of an ontology which works for you.
Yes. And the thing that I love about that process is that when you go through the work of defining your taxonomy, for example, that's hierarchical, right? Hierarchies, you naturally get to the point where your users will be like basically jumping out of their skin because they want to create relationships outside of the hierarchy. And that's like a natural organic indicator that you're ready start to progress, that you've reached the bounds and the limits of defining things as a hierarchy, parent child, and now you want to stretch outside of that box, and that's the way it should happen.
So it's a problem of inertia. It's
Yeah.
getting started. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks. Over to you, Vivek.
Yes. So my question then becomes, because what you are telling, and I'm assuming you worked with a bunch of these large enterprises who possibly seem to have gone through their own painful implementation cycles, which have possibly not given them a lot of results, right? And there comes in one more person, saying one more new thing. How do people respond? What's like, somebody was being burned twice, or like a bunch of times by Accenture, McKinsey, Deloitte, or
Yes.
one of these consulting firms, or some sort of a RAG implementation here and there, and then you tell them we will do boring foundational work for whatever weeks or months possibly, which you can't even see, by the way. It won't be like tangible, right? Because you're building foundation stuff, right? How do people respond to that? I'm just trying to imagine a CFO hearing this.
Yeah. And I think that's why, the ontology pipeline type workflow has worked for me is you get done with controlled vocabularies where you've defined your terms in a flat list, use it with your LLM and that will derive value. So the way that I manage it is, yes, it's boring, rigorous work for months and months and months, but it's iterative. So you start with controlled vocabularies and then you have an artifact that you can leverage or multiple that you can use. And you want to test that because you might need to restructure or include more terminology or less in that controlled vocabulary. You have output and you have ability to test. Then you move on to taxonomy, same thing in your SCOS model. You have an artifact, you have taxonomy or taxonomies, like use them with your LLMs, test them and iterate. And then you move on to metadata schemas, right? And you start to imbue structure into those using just lightweight ontologies. And then, wow, you can test that, right? So you move on to this different sort of metadata structure and representation. And so, with the idea is to come up with a plan and a process that actually delivers artifacts of value along. Now, when we say symbolic AI, it doesn't mean just like if you look at Jan LeCun's world models, for example, he relies heavily on taxonomies mostly. And so we become really myopic and think ontologies are it. Everyone wants an ontology, but there's like work and process along the way, and there's other formats that drive value that are necessary to accompany ontologies that are part of knowledge graphs. Knowledge graphs, after all, are architectures. So, really, what we're working towards is building a knowledge infrastructure. And that's what's missing. I've been saying that for now
Yeah.
3 years, that like we need knowledge infrastructure. It's not knowledge. We're kind of skirting around and dancing and playing with knowledge, the idea of knowledge management, but ultimately, this is like a new architecture and infrastructure. Yeah.
We use that word very cautiously when we go into some of our meetings because it's very difficult to wrap your head around the depth of how critical some of that asset could be and how easily somebody could like handmade. Yeah, we have knowledge infrastructure, some version of that. But thanks for that. Right, very very helpful. So the Goldilocks. What I'm hearing you say is the taxonomy is potentially your first Goldilocks in this sense, right? To sort of and then you operationalize it potentially into a specific implementation or agent or AI application, and that's where you start seeing value, like or you realize real value,
Well, and
and then you go on from there.
not only that, this is like a discovery that I think because I am writing a piece right now where I'm sort of reflecting on pre-AI and post-AI and how am I operating differently and how is it different generally in the marketplace and people's appetite for incorporating those into their architectures. And what I realized was if an organization struggles to implement and maintain the shape, for example, of an RDF hierarchy, right? Parent-child relations, say it's a 3-level hierarchy in SCOS RDF. If an organization cannot handle operationalizing that, you better find out early, because once you get to ontology where you're introducing that complexity, it's not any easier. It's like the training wheels. So that's part of the iterative process. And for a lot of organizations, they get stuck at taxonomy because their systems are not oriented, nor is the discipline there in order to maintain and proliferate the complexity
Yeah,
of ontological systems.
it's
So these organizations, like when come with this asset, this final artifact, you put it on that table, right? Um,
Mhm.
what is their role in this, in maintaining this? Where's the human's role once this is done?
Yeah,
And
good
how
question.
does this flow?
Geez, and it's so nuanced for different organizations. So I'm working right now at an organization where we got the first iteration done, and then you have to like hold the line and immediately get your governance and your style guides and your guidance and your Confluence pages and your SharePoint and your feedback forms, because ultimately you have to involve people in your human, it is very much a human in the loop. At first, that process of implementing, for example, your first SCOS taxonomy or thesaurus, that is your first, like, kind of dipping your toe in that symbolic water. And so you have to have ways to communicate, right? It's a two-way communication. And at first, it's very much augmentation before automating any sort of processes. I think that's the second point. So governance and augmentation, because you're trying to solidify feedback loops and communication and incorporating new terminology. How do we deprecate things? How do we change definitions? How do we, you know, uh, have, a program where we can make these taxonomies widely available, like in an internal application that people can navigate and interact with. So the governance piece is like core. So
Yeah.
you can't move forward without it.
All right. Now that you've said that, it also, so for those who are new to this whole world of symbolic approaches, knowledges, infra, long-term asset, and so on, some consulting gigs, there's a vibe that it's a once and done thing.
Oh,
It's a
gosh.
lift and shift, or some version of that, or it triggers that, right? It's the marketing hype triggers that feeling that once you get the ontology, or once you have, some of this stuff in place, you're done, right? But the fact remains that knowledge is a dynamic asset. Knowledge evolves, knowledge sunsets, knowledge is deprecated. It's a thing, right?
Yes.
So, and again, do note that the point that the leader you spoke about earlier in the conversation, that ontologists are like dinosaurs. How many of them are left eventually in this world, right? So the worldview is very, very limited, unfortunately, today. The worldview on the assets, relevance, and longevity itself is, again, fairly challenged right now. And then now they have to also, build and maintain and, add layers to it and so on and so forth, right? It just sounds like a new function or a new org. Maybe it's AI power. Absolutely. I think it will be AI power, will exist eventually in these companies that want to possibly actually go to production with their agents of staff, right? What would that org look like? Of course, there will be an
New org.
ontologist, but or there is none. What have you seen out there in reality? Are people open to the idea of building this?
Finance and biosciences, I think, has the most rigorous and mature versions of this, as does cultural heritage. So libraries, museums, archives, those types of things, right? So we see that reflected in those organizations, and all across all of those organizations. Taxonomies are fundamental. Like, you have to have that muscle. You have teams at like Capital One and Bloomberg and JP Morgan, where you have a VP of taxonomy and ontology. You have an entire team or several teams that are organized around this. So cramming this type of work into your data science team or throwing it at machine engineers is not the solution.
Yeah.
It does take hiring the talent that is going to help to drive the program. Now, with Tony Seal and myself and Katerina Kari, we have the Knowledge Graph Academy. We've graduated over 100 students, and that teaches people, the fundamentals of knowledge graphs, including taxonomy and ontology. But, so there is some upskilling that has to happen in place as well.
Yeah.
Now, there's also the thing about knowledge management, because knowledge itself is ever contracting and, contract, expand. It's just the nature of knowledge and knowledge management. That also means that muscle has to be woven into your entire organization.
Yeah.
Right. And that comes with maturity, and doesn't mean that you have tools in place for knowledge elicitation and capture, and, and that you have consistency in how you're able to record things and store things in a way that's structured and can be represented by ontologies or taxonomies, for example, whether it be an auto tagging system, ontology driven ontology or tagging system, or there's very nuanced approaches, but it really comes with the maturity of the organization and the realization that this is not a data problem. I think that's the biggest blocker, is organizations that think this is a data problem. It's not a data problem.
It's not.
No. Data are not going away. Like, we still need to collect and store and query data. We still need dashboards. We still need finance and accounting and all of that goodness, and supply chain and whatever else. But like, when we're talking about structuring these things to have meaning, the first thing people go for is automation. And I think that hunger is so insatiable that it gets in the way of best practices and actually doing the work to build a program that's sustainable.
That's so apt. I'm just wondering, most mid-market companies, not enterprises, who don't have knowledge management functions, or as formalized as finance or pharma or life sciences, what would their path look like?
You
I'm,
have
I'm
to
just trying to
hire some
imagine.
people. That's the thing. I see this like this I I can't like for a while I said, oh well, it just takes upskilling. It just takes, it it just, it really is like you have data engineers, you hire data scientists, you hire content strategists. And there has been this reluctance to actually hire the skill sets necessary because there's this misnomer, misunderstanding that
Certainly. Yeah.
ontologies can just be automated and just deployed. And it's just, that it's not a
It's a
discipline.
prompt. It's just a
It's a
prompt.
prompt, right?
It's a prompt
And
away. Yeah.
yeah, and that's not I mean, it's if you take your data science team and your data analytics team and your data engineering teams and your data, content strategy teams and like all of those functions throughout your organization, if you take those things seriously, if you take your product management seriously, then why
Yeah.
aren't you taking your knowledge seriously? Like
Knowledge. Seriously.
I'm at the point where it's like, I don't, you know what, if you're not willing to invest in it, then that shows me that you're not
Yeah.
serious.
Serious about this. Yeah.
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 We, Dilip, who's our third co-founder,
Yes.
he is 64, 65, 65. Yeah. So he carries the wisdom.
Yes.
And we often, joke around that. Maybe knowledge is too boomer of a word. It's not Gen Z enough, but it's not
Gosh.
millennial enough.
Yeah.
That's why it's not landing in these, in these sales, in these AI sales cycles today, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's education and
Yeah.
critical thinking, and it goes along with AI literacy and all of those things. So it depends on your willingness to dive into the domain and really want to understand the origin of context, right? Context was a word that proliferated throughout semantic web and ontology based systems for decades. Now we are so like, this word launched onto the stage and it became associated with a lot of functions and features and AI tools, and then emerged as it's a verb, it's a noun, it's an adjective. It operates across all those planes now. And so how do we distinguish, and in place, I think that context was an attempt to rebrand knowledge, right? The problem is
Yeah.
that we took the word context and it became, again, like I said before, nebulous, but it lost its meaning.
So
If context was meant to mean knowledge, then it lost its meaning. Right.
I can so relate to that. To the point that we're now sick of that word internally in our Slack. We don't even use that word. It's just borderline dangerous, right? And I feel guilty that we have spoken about it so many times, but that's just how bad the situation out there right now really is. Yeah.
I totally
Yeah.
related when you said like you try not to use it because I try not to use it because like there's so many ways I can use it and now I can't use it because then like it's like one of those words that you didn't know was a bad word and now it's a bad word and you
Oh,
can't
it's
use
a
it.
bad word. It's so bad. I actually went through, I command F'd in my ONZZ 39.19 standard, which is the controlled vocabulary guidelines, the ONZZ 39. And I was like, how many times is context mentioned in here? It was like something, and that's a 2004 document. And it was 120 plus times, right? But it makes sense because that was relative to exactly that domain space of building SCOS taxonomies and thesauri. And then here we are, and I it's sad that that word has lost its heft and its original intent and
Yeah.
meaning, where now we're moving into the space. Okay, if we can't use the word context, can we use knowledge, so that we can be more specific in terms of what we're implementing and what we're trying to build. Yeah.
So you said something interesting there, Jessica, about product managers, data science teams, tech people, like whatever, right? Like you expect people to be controlling this. Uh, there's a school of thought that is probably looking ahead and expecting that people won't be controlling this. How do you see, like how do you decide between what goes to the person like a human, and what goes to the machine? Like,
Yeah.
is there a rule that we can use?
Yeah, I recently wrote a piece called Augmentation Automation in the Neurosymbolic Loop that spoke exactly to this, which was really, if people don't understand historically how we ended up with this version of AI that we're playing with right now, the generative AI, that means that you're losing or you're missing the context as to, like what we're doing here. So the automation school of AI, you know, augmentation, that sort of split in the road, our display systems, our mouses, our keyboards are all forms of augmentation, right? Those are very simplistic forms of augmentation that come out of that school going back to the 1950s and 60s, and using algorithms and using similar sort of components or elements, statistical predictive systems combined with some symbolism. Now, the really interesting thing is automation has largely followed the human replacement theory. So this is an actual thing people are participating and engaging in, is human replacement theory. The original school of thought coming out of the Dartmouth summer, where artificial intelligence, that term was coined with Minsky and Rockefeller and these different characters, Claude Shannon, the original thesis, hypothesis was, if we describe a problem or a process well enough, it can be automated. And that has failed in loops throughout time, going from 1956 to where we are now. So when we decide to choose what is automated, it's based off of research and proof, right? If you're and so there's a general philosophy in AI generally as a discipline, whether it be augmentation or automation, but there is a general philosophy that you augment before automating anything. If you are comfortable automating a task without even testing, without even bringing scientific process into the conversation, then I'm worried. I'm worried for you. I'm worried for your program. I'm worried for your automation. You know, that augmentation process could be like a shorter term because you are so certain it's going to work. But the neurosymbolic loop is something that can be introduced. And that's where you have like a human in the loop with some symbolic, with the generative AI, right? So that you're combining and sort of fine tuning these processes until you can be absolutely confident that a machine can operate on a certain process or procedure autonomously, right? And so to think that you can just free something into the ether universe without any sort of scientific process sort of defies like how we, you know, best practices. And so I think it's really important to understand that, because for most people AI is new to them. It's completely new. So it becomes like a magical oracle that you think is just going to manifest like a genie out of a bottle and glitter all over the, you know, your
Yeah, sparkly
environment. And
dust.
it doesn't
Yes.
really, you know, it's there actually is practice science, and throwing everything at an LLM and seeing what sticks is pretty darn expensive.
So what I'm hearing you say is like, okay, it could be that they can do it autonomously, but there's no way that you're gonna just not get there. You have to do something augmented and then decide if you're gonna let go and do that or not.
Yeah, and perhaps it means like RHL, you know, reinforcement with, you know, doing reinforcement with humans in the loop, right? Maybe that's your form of augmentation. Maybe it's like codifying a knowledge elicitation program. You know, we hear a lot from coming out of context graphs like tacit knowledge. It's like, okay, so how are you recording that and what does that look like? Are you going to automate that? Because that could be pretty risky given legal and finance, right? And so
Yeah.
you have to, it's like actual strategy. You know, I've been with companies. I think that's the biggest misnomer is, or not misnomer, but that was the wrong word. There's a misconception that and I think there's sort of a general panic with organizations, and that has everything to do with board members and stock prices and everything,
Yeah.
you know, where we see this sort of desperation and this sort of throwing everything into LLMs and YOLOing it. And the problem is like there's no strategy there. A lot of companies, including really big companies, are operating with zero strategy. And when I see, when you actually develop strategy, you can structure appropriately these like reinforcement learning programs, this knowledge elicitation programs, this augmentation, these like roadmaps where you go augmentation to automation. That's strategy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there is a lot of FOMO right now, unfortunately. It's opportunity, right?
It's
It's
opportunity.
it's also a lot of opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I know we're on time right now, but one last question for you, Jessica. I know, again, not sure if you've heard the word context engineer, GTM engineer. You have, of course, right? Should we officially coin the word ontology engineer as well? Or
That
is that
already
redundant
exists.
fundamentally? They already exist, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that already exists.
So,
There's
yeah.
ontologist is different than an
Ontology.
ontology engineer. So an
Uh-huh.
ontologist is someone who builds and structures, they do the domain research, they define the meanings, they, build the ontologies, the schemas, that's their role. And an ontology engineer helps to implement things like Sparkle and Shackle, shape constraint language in order to elicit the indexing and retrieval and helping to operationalize the ontology. Like those are defined roles and they're not new roles. I was actually looking last night because I got some notification for a job and I'm like, oh, an ontologist. And it was like an ontology analyst. That was the first time I'd seen ontology analyst come up.
Mhm,
And I, of
mhm.
course, clicked on it because I was a little confused. Never heard that before. So I think that, in the same way that we're defining and redefining the word ontology for marketing purposes, we're also seeing these like really interesting jobs and job listings come up that aren't quite, yeah. Like ontologists at Amazon are really structured because I used to work at Amazon. Ontologists at Amazon are generally taxonomists in the outside world.
Yeah.
There's some mismatch between, so it's really about the job
Yeah.
description. Now you'll notice that a lot of these roles, they're just what we call in the library world copy cataloging, where job listings will copy other people's
Yeah.
job listings with the same requirements and the same with
Yeah.
and so the other risk is because organizations don't really know what they're hiring for and they're just copying and pasting, that there's a lot of mismatch between the actual job to be done and the job listing, because there's just a lot of education that needs to happen.
They've busted so many myths today. And I'm really excited about this. But yes, Jessica, thank you so much for your time today. I'm really
Thank you
glad
guys.
that we were able to do this. And so
Thank
it's a
you.
I know it's
very
been a few months.
fun, yeah, but a super fun conversation.
Thank you guys.
It's been a really, really, I think a lot of people who are not, who don't live beneath, these terms, right, will get a sense of calm more than anything else, that the world is not ending tomorrow. Jobs are not getting out.
It's a lot. I mean, it's change management, like in orgs is hard. Change management in the world is even harder. So yeah, we're all in a flux of change. And I think we all just want stability. That's what I see the larger social construct is more just everyone wanting stability, and humans need disambiguation, right? We don't do
Yes,
well. It's part of
you don't
human
do well.
happiness is built on knowing your place and knowing your job and having a purpose, and so I think that that's the larger situation that we're all struggling with.
So true. So beautifully said. Once again, thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
your time.
Thank you guys.